Okay, now before we jump into the text, we just got through singing a song, and by the way, you all sounded amazing. And we sang the song that said, I trust in God. And I hope that when you sing songs, and I love how even before that, we sang earlier, and we're standing on the promises of God, right? So when you sing songs, do you understand, do you contemplate the words that you're singing? Do you ask yourself, is there any truth to what we're singing? Because the reality is that when we sing songs, we are really, the purpose of it is not to just sing to get to the message. The purpose of it is that we would all learn, that we would all grow, that we would all understand something about God through the songs that we're singing. So I want to ask you a question. Now, we sang the song, and I know you sing it, but I really want to ask you a question. What do you trust in? What do you trust in? So what would you put in the blank? I trust in what? What do you trust in? Because the reason I ask that question is, as you ponder that thought, let me frame it maybe another way. What is currently holding your world together? What's holding your world together? See, every morning we wake up. Your eyes open, you're laying in bed, whether the alarm went off or whether you don't need an alarm, you just wake up. When you and I wake up in the morning, we wake up to our world most days feeling as if everything is in order. We wake up most days feeling as if, hey, you know what, I got this all together. And because of that, we live our lives with some degree of happiness. Think about it. Most days you wake up in the morning and you're not worried, you're not terrified, you're not concerned. Most days when you wake up in the morning, you're thinking, hey, I've just got this plan that I have to go execute, that I'm going to get up and I'm going to go do my, whatever your work schedule is. I'm going to get in my car, I'm going to drive, I'm going to go do my job, I'm going to come home, we're going to have dinner, and you've got this plan in your head. But the reason that you wake up in the morning and you're not in a panic is because you feel like your world is in order. Now, what is it that you're trusting in? What is it that you're trusting in that gives you the assurance when your eyes open in the morning? Is it your finances? Do you feel like, hey man, like life is good, I'm fine because I got money in the bank. I can pay my bills, I know what I'm doing, I kind of got some things going for me in the right direction, I have confidence about my future because of my finances? Or is it your health? You wake up in the morning, most of us, unless you're going through an ailment, most people don't wake up in the morning and the first thing they think about is their health. And the reason is because your health is good. So your world, therefore, is in order and all things are going fine. Or is it your education? Maybe you feel like because you have an education, because you have a degree, or because maybe your education is in a trade, because you went and learned a trade, that your confidence is in that thing, that job, that career. Maybe it's your family. Is it your family? Do you feel like because you woke up in the morning, your eyes open, my world's all together because everybody in my family is healthy and all things are going normal? Is that where your trust lies? Or is it in your friends? Maybe you feel like your world is in order because all your friends, they're all good to you, and there's no strife, there's no concern, there's no difficulties going on, so you just wake up and when your eyes open, you're not in a panic. Your world is all together because your friends, you and your friends, you're all good. Last question before we jump in. Does what or whom you trust in, does it have the capacity to sustain all of the hopes that you have? Does what or whom that you say when you put in that blank, what I trust in blank, when you put that in there, does that thing that you feel like has your whole world operating well right now, does that thing have the capacity to sustain all of your hopes? Because listen, if it's your finances, you're one bad stock market day away from all of that going south. If it's your health, you're one doctor's visit away from all of that going south. If it's your friends, you're one Facebook post, Instagram post, whatever post away from all of that going south. If it's your family, you're probably one Thanksgiving dinner away from it all going south. So does what or whom you place your trust have the capacity to sustain the level of your hopes? Did you know that, I'm sure you know this, but hope is an essential part of all of our lives. Psychology proves it. I'm going to share with you some psychology reports that talk about the value of hope in our everyday lives. The reason that most of us wake up every morning with eyes wide open and no concerns, and we have a hope for the future. And that hope is because everything seems to be fine, right? We have hope. Now listen to this. This is according to psychology studies. It says this: hope not only gives us meaning, but it's good for us. It leads to positive emotions and optimism and is a key component of happiness. It aids in depression and anxiety. Maybe that's why our world is in such bad shape. We have more people who are anxious. We have more people who are dealing with depression today. Well, could it be that the reason for that is they have no hope? But again, the report goes on to say it aids in depression and anxiety, according to a study by Dr. Randolph Arnua. Another study shows that the greater the hope, the lower the anxiety, and vice versa. Other research also concludes this, along with people having higher levels of happiness and well-being. In fact, research shows that people cope better with physical injuries, such as diseases like cancer, when there's hope. That when somebody has hope for healing, that they're able to go through it better and actually improve quicker. A study shows that hope leads college students towards academic success and achievements, that if you have a hope for the future, that if you feel as if things are going well, that your family back home, they're fine, that your finances and your financial debt is going to be taken care of, that if you have a teacher or a professor who actually cares and is helping you, that there's hope for the future, and that those students, according to psychological studies, do much better than those who have no hope. Hope relieves stress and helps you develop healthier habits. There's also a lower mortality rate for people who have hope. Overall, they would say, the study would go on to say this: hope benefits mental and physical health and helps you overcome obstacles and achieve your goals. Now, hope is what helped three people that I just want to share with you real quick. Some of whom you've probably heard of, some may not. Louis Zamperini, Liz Murray, and Nick Vujicic. Now, if you're not familiar, Louis Zamperini, his story was told in a book called Unbroken. There was a movie made about it. And basically that whole deal tells the story of a man who had hope in spite of the most difficult circumstances in World War II. He was beaten, he was tortured, he was unjustly treated, and he had hope through it. And his hope is what sustained him, that one of his partners didn't make it through it because he lacked hope. Liz Murray, if you haven't heard of her, Liz Murray, her parents were addicts. And her mom was HIV infected. Liz was bullied in school for being unclean and being homeless. Due to humiliation, she dropped out of school. She said, I can't handle this. I can't deal with this. I deal with my own inner struggles, but I can't deal with people picking on me for things that I know to be true about me. But she was determined to be the best. So she dropped out, but she returned to school when she was 17, and she had this hope, this desire that she could do it, and she would make her way through education. And she went from homeless to Harvard, and she wrote a book about it. Literally, that was the title of the book. It was a memoir about survival and her journey of going from homeless to Harvard. They made a movie about that as well, and it was the reason she was able to do that is because she had hope. And then Nick Vujicic. Nick Vujicic was born with phocomelia, which basically he was born with no arms and no legs. Can you imagine? I mean, it'd be one thing to be born with no arms, but I got my legs, I can walk around, or to be born without legs, but I still have my arms. He was born with no arms and no legs. He was bullied most of his life, and in his testimony, he was even suicidal. Then he met someone else born without limbs who was helpful to him, who motivated him, who gave him hope. And so Nick Vujicic then used his life and is allowing God to use his life to go and talk to people who are facing a life of hopelessness, to give them hope. And here's what he says. He's quoted as saying, if you need a friend, become someone else's. If you need hope, give hope to others. So those three people got to where they are, not because the circumstances were stacked in their favor, but simply because one day they allowed hope to generate and to drive all of their ambitions and to drive who they became. So where do you find hope? What is it that's holding your world together? In your head, what do you think it is? What are you putting your trust in? Hope is commonly used in our culture today. We use it in our vocabulary. We use it in our sentences. And the problem is that when we talk about hope, what we talk about and how we use it is this way. We think of hope as a wish. We think like hope means that when we say I hope, you could change that word out for I wish. I hope that this happens, or I hope that my health is good, or I hope that this happens for me. But in that context, it would mean a wish, and its strength is the strength of the person's desire. Like if a desire is strong enough, then that then becomes my hope. But biblical hope is different. Let me give you the definition for biblical hope. Biblical hope is the confident expectation of what God has promised, and its strength is His faithfulness. See, that's different when our hope is not based on our desire, because we know that our desires are there, but when we think about hope in the biblical context, our hope rests on God. And it rests not on our faithfulness, but on His faithfulness. In today's text, Paul is going to give us one final proof of why he is sure that God has not abandoned the nation of Israel. And can I say that I believe He saved the best for last? And oh, by the way, these reasons that he's going to give us are the very same reasons that you and I should also never feel as if we were being abandoned by God. This should give you hope today that God is always there, that God is always with. If you have ever doubted God's activity in your life, if you have ever wondered if God knows what you're going through, if you have ever thought that God's lack of activity was due to either His unavailability or your unlovability, then today's message is for you, and I hope that you would find some hope and some confidence today from what Paul is going to share with us. So Paul is going to give us 6 reasons why we can trust in God, and I hope you're a note taker because you should take these down. And these are not mine. These are just coming straight from the Apostle Paul. In Romans chapter 11, verse 25, we'll start there. So Paul would say it this way: lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the faithfulness of the Gentiles has come in. So number 1, if you're taking notes, God's timing is always perfect. God's timing is always perfect. What Paul is telling us here is that what has happened to Israel, it's all part of God's plan. Now, I know what you're thinking because I think the same thing. Sometimes I just wish God would step in a little quicker. Sometimes I wish God would come to the rescue a lot sooner. It's like, God, I know you've heard me praying. And God, I know that you're omniscient. You know all things. You know what I'm going through. And God, I just wish that you would step in sooner. Have you ever wondered and kind of hoped out loud to yourself that God, if you would answer this prayer right now, everybody in the world would know that you're God? But He doesn't always do that. And it leads us to the question where we begin to question God. And then if we're not careful, we'll begin to put our hope in other things. But Paul is going to remind us here that God's timing is always perfect. He mentions in this verse that, this whole hardening of Israel, he says, how long? I mean, people are wondering, how long is this going to last? And he gives them a clue. He says, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. In Ecclesiastes, the wisest man who ever lived would write this. He says in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11, He has made everything beautiful in its what? In its time. Also, He has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I mean, Solomon is telling us He has made everything beautiful in its time. Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, Paul, writing to the church in Galatia, says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. So Paul is pointing back to, remember Israel, remember how long you prayed, remember how the prophets would prophesy about the coming Messiah, and you waited a really long time, and at the right time, God sent his Son. God's timing is always perfect. I want to read you a quote from a guy named Adam Kappa here. Listen to what he says. He says, trust in God's timing. It's better to wait a while and things fall into place than to rush and have things fall apart. God's timing is perfect. Don't ever try to get out in front of God. Don't ever try to take things in your own hands, because when you do, you're putting your hope in your own abilities. You're putting your hope in your own wisdom. You're putting your hope in your own knowledge. And God is far superior in all of those things to us. And so Adam Kappa would say, hey, don't rush, because when we rush, things fall apart. Better to wait on God and let things fall into place. Here's another good quote. I don't know who it's from. It was unknown, but it just says this: God has perfect timing, never early, never late. It takes a little patience and faith, but it's worth the wait. Number 2, let's look at verse 26 here. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Number 2, God's promises are always true. His promises are always true. Again, this is why it's so important that you and I read the Bible daily. It's where the collection of God's promises are. And if we believe that God's promises are always true, and we know what God's promises are, it enables us to have hope in the unforeseeable future. What Paul is saying here in verse 26 is he's referencing Isaiah chapter 59, verses 20 and 21. He's basically quoting straight from that. And you ought to go home today and read Isaiah 60. It follows right on the heels of that promise. But God has promised to save his people. And basically what it's going to tell you is that he will keep his promise. Listen to Numbers chapter 23:19. God is not man that he should lie, or the son of man that he should change his mind. He has said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? God's promises are always true. John Piper, he's God too smart for me to even listen to, but if you ever get a chance, go listen to some of his messages. But here's one thing that John Piper said: one of the great enemies of hope is forgetting God's promises. So if you find yourself here today and you are in a place where you are feeling a little hopeless, what you need to do and what I need to do in those moments is we need to get into the Word of God and be reminded of God's faithful promises, because God's promises are always true. James MacDonald said this: when God promises, he's not saying, I will try. That's not what he's saying. He means, I can and I will. God's promises are always true. His promises may often feel delayed, but they are never denied. Number 3, the third characteristic of God that can allow us to know that God would never abandon Israel, nor will he ever abandon his church, nor will he abandon you individually if your faith is in him. Number 3, verses 27 and 28. And this will be my covenant with them, and I will take away their sins. As regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. God's covenants are irrevocable. God doesn't put a covenant out there and then go, hey, you know what? I've changed my mind on that. They're irrevocable. What is a covenant? Well, if you were here over a year ago, we did a whole sermon series on covenants. A covenant is basically this: it is an agreement between God and man where God promises blessings if the conditions of the covenant are kept, and curses if the conditions are not. Now, the beautiful thing about it is the covenant doesn't depend on us. The covenant depends on God and his faithfulness. The covenant, and not only that, but God in so many ways, again, you'd have to go back and listen to the series, but in so many ways, God's covenant were fulfilled not by us, but they were fulfilled by him. He's the one who took the covenants and the burden of the covenants upon himself. God chose Israel in his grace, not because of their goodness, not because he met all of or they met all of God's requirements. He chose Israel based on his goodness and his faithfulness. And by the way, in this text here, in what we just read, he says, now in regards to the gospel, that's God's grace. It's God's unmerited favor. In regards to the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. So in other words, because of the gospel, the Gentiles and the Israelites had this animosity towards the Gentiles because they were coming to faith. But he says, but in regards to election, and election also means grace, not merit, that God chose. The Jewish people are enemies to the unbelieving Gentiles because of their hostile attitude towards the gospel, but to God, the Jewish people are beloved for the Father's sake. They are his people, and God will not break his covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He will not break it. Number 4, verse 29. Another reason that we can have confidence that God would not abandon us, or in Paul's argument that he has not abandoned Israel. Verse 29, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. In other words, God's character is unchanging. God's character is absolutely unchanging. Listen to what he says in Malachi chapter 3. For I, the Lord, do not what? God doesn't change. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He will always be the same. He doesn't get in bad moods. He doesn't get angry because he doesn't get his way in the sense of how you deal with him or how I react and respond to him. He knows. He knows all things. And so God's character, it never changes. God gifts to Israel, and God's calling of Israel cannot be taken back. They cannot be changed, and his promises to you cannot be changed either. In Romans chapter 3, verse 3, Paul said this earlier in our study of Romans. What if some were unfaithful, he would say. Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? And the understood answer to that is absolutely not. Just because you and I are unfaithful on a day-to-day basis because we don't get it right all of the time doesn't nullify the faithfulness of God. Look in verses 30 through 32. Paul continues to write, for just as you were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their obedience, so they too have now been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you, they may also now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. Number 5, God's grace is inexhaustible. It never runs out. God's grace is never going to run out on you. I know what you think, because we do it with people. We sometimes, I think we think about God in the way we think about ourselves. Sometimes people hurt us and harm us, and we'll extend grace. And then they harm us and hurt us again, and we extend a little more. But we all know that sometimes in our hearts, grace runs out. We know that sometimes in our life, the way we deal with people and the way people deal with us, sometimes their grace runs out with us. But God's grace is inexhaustible. His grace never, ever runs out. And we must remember that God chose the Jews so that the Gentiles might be saved. This is important. God chose the Jews so that the Gentiles might be saved. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 is where you'll find that. It's not going to be on the screen, but in Genesis chapter 12, here's what we're told. In you, when God makes the covenant with Abraham, he says, in you, all families of earth will be blessed. All meaning not just you as a Jewish nation, but everybody outside of the nation of Israel. The tragedy was that Israel became exclusive. They kept everything to themselves. They didn't take the good news of what God was doing and take the blessings of the covenant to other people. So the question we have to ask ourselves is this: why has God blessed us? And I think we talked about this last week. Why has God blessed you? God blesses us just as he did with Israel so that we can be a blessing to others. He blesses you and he blesses me so that we can be a blessing to others. We talked about this, I think, in our study on Wednesday night in Philippians. Who are you being a blessing to? Who are you being a blessing to? How has your faith in Jesus impacted other people around you? The nation of Israel was meant to be a blessing to the other nations, and they refused. They decided to just keep to themselves. And when they did, God said, okay, I'm going to harden you, and I'm going to let this thing go outside of the walls of Israel like it was designed to do anyway. But God's grace, it's inexhaustible. He has not given up on Israel. And what you and I need to know is that there is never a moment in our entire life when God's grace is not sufficient for you. There's never a moment in your life. I don't care how far you've gone. I don't care what you've done. There's never a moment when God's grace is not sufficient for you. Lastly, verses 33 through 36. Paul continues. He says, "Oh, the depth and the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgment and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen." So number sixth reason that we can know that God has not and will not, he has not abandoned Israel and he will not abandon you. God's wisdom is unsearchable. He says it right here. He says, how unsearchable are his judgments. Having contemplated God's great plan of salvations for the Jews and the Gentiles, all Paul could do was pull back and go, you know what? I'm just going to, right now, I'm going to praise God in the moment. And here's what it should lead us to understand. The more we study his ways, the more it should lead us to praise. When we show up here on a Sunday, when we're singing songs, that's why I asked a while ago about, do you pay attention to the words that you sing? It should remind you of something. What it should remind all of us of is God's faithfulness to his promises, which ultimately becomes a blessing to us. And so as we consider his ways, as we study his word, as we look into what he is teaching us, as we consider his ways, it should lead us to praise. We should be the loudest people on the planet on Sunday morning because we know how much we've been forgiven, and we know how much good God has been to us, and how much blessing he has poured out. And by the way, when you sing his praise, it becomes an encouragement to the people sitting next to you. When you sing his praise, and when you sing it with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, when you worship him in that way, when you worship him in spirit and truth, when you do that, it becomes a powerful movement of God. That your life then becomes a blessing to the people that are sitting around you. So let me ask you one more time, where do you find hope? What is it that you would say today is kind of holding your world together? What or whom are you putting your trust in? In 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 through 10, listen to what Paul writes to a young disciple named Timothy. He says, "Have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourself for godliness. For while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. The saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance." Look at verse 10. This is so good. This is so good. "For to this end we toil and strive, because we have our" what? We have our hope set on the living God, who is the Savior of all people, especially of those who believe. The hymn we sing sometimes in church goes a little something like this: "My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness." Where is your hope today? What are you placing your hope in? What do you have your trust in? I trust in